From My Life with Chimps by Eugene Goodall, Part 2. I began to learn more about the other creatures that shared the forests with the chimpanzees. There were four kinds of monkeys, in addition to the baboons, and many smaller animals such as squirrels and mongooses. There were also a whole variety of nocturnal, nighttime creatures, porcupines, and civets, creatures looking like raccoons, and all manners of rats and mice. Only a few animals in the forest at Gombe were potentially dangerous, mainly buffalo and leopards. Bush pigs can be dangerous too, but only if you threaten them or their young. And, of course, there are poisonous snakes, 7 different kinds. Once, as I arrived on the peak in the early morning before it was properly light, I saw the dark shape of a large animal looming in front of me. I stood quite still. My heart began to beat fast, for I realized it was a buffalo. Many hunters fear buffalo more than lions or elephants. By a lucky chance, the wind was blowing from him to me, so he couldn't smell me. He was peacefully grazing in the opposite direction and chewing his cud. He hadn't heard my approach. Always I try to move as quietly as I can in the bush. So, that was only 10 yards from him. He had no idea I was there. Very slowly I retreated. Another time, as I was sitting on the peak, I heard a strange mewing sound. I looked around, and there, about 15 yards away, a leopard was approaching. I could see the black and white tip of its tail above the tall grass. It was walking along the little trail that led directly to where I sat. Leopards are not usually dangerous unless they have been wounded, but I was frightened of them in those days, probably as a result of my experience with the leopard and the wolfhound 2 years before. And so I very silently moved away and looked for chimps in another valley. Later, I went back to the peak. I found that, just like any cat, that leopard had been very curious. There, in the exact place where I had been sitting, he had left his mark, his droppings. Most of the time, though nothing more alarming than insects disturbed my vigils on the peak. It began to feel like home. I carried a little tin trunk up there. In it, I kept a kettle, some sugar, coffee, and a tin mug. Then, when I got tired from a long trek to another valley, I could make a drink in the middle of the day. I kept a blanket up there, too. And when the chimps slept near the peak, I slept there, so that I could be close by in the morning. I loved to be up there at night, especially when there was a moon. If I heard the coughing grunt of a leopard, I just prayed and pulled the blanket over my head. Chimps sleep all night, just as we do. From the peak, I often watched how they made their nests or beds. First, the chimp bent a branch down over some solid foundation, such as a fork or two parallel branches, holding it in place with his feet. He then bent another over it. Then he folded another of the first branch back over the second, and so on. He often ended up by picking lots of small, soft, leafy twigs to make a pillow. Chimps like their comforts. I've learned over the years that infants sleep in their nests with their mothers until they are about 5 years old or until the next baby is born and the older child has to make its own bed. I never returned to camp before sunset, but even when I slept on the peak, I first went down to have supper with Mum and tell her what I had seen that day, and she would tell me what she had been doing. Mom set up a clinic. She handed medicine to any of the local Africans, mostly fishermen, who were sick. Once she cured an old man who was very ill indeed. Word about this cure spread far and wide, and sometimes patients would walk for miles to get treatment from the wonderful white woman doctor. Her clinic was very good for me. It meant the local people realized we wanted to help. When Mom had to go back to England after 4 months to manage things at home, the Africans wanted, in turn, to help me. Of course, Mom worried about leaving me on my own. Dominic was a wonderful cook and great company. He was not really reliable, so Louis Leakey asked Hassan to come all the way from Lake Victoria to help with the boat and engine. It was lovely to see his handsome, smiling face again, and his arrival relieved Mum's mind to no end. Of course, I missed her after she'd gone, but I didn't have time to be lonely. There was too much to do. Soon after she left, I got back one evening and was greeted by an excited Dominic. He told me about a big male chimp had spent an hour feeding on some fruit of one of the oil nut palms growing in the camp clearing. Afterwards, he climbed down, gone over to my tent, and taken the banana that had just been put there for my supper. This was fantastic news. For months, the chimps had been running off when they saw me. Now it actually visited my camp. Perhaps he would come again. The next day I waited, in case he did. What a luxury to lie in until 7 a.m. As the hours went by, I began to fear that the chimp wouldn't come. Finally, at about 4 in the afternoon, I heard it rustling in the undergrowth opposite my tent, and a black shape appeared on the other side of the clearing. I recognized him at once. It was the handsome male with a dense white beard, and I had already named him David Graybeard. Quite calmly, he climbed into the palm and feasted on its nuts. And then he helped himself to the bananas I set out for him. There were ripe palm nuts on that tree for another 5 days, and David Graybeard visited 3 more times and got lots of bananas. A month later, when another palm tree in camp bore ripe fruits, David again visited us. And on one of those occasions, he actually took a banana from my hand. I could hardly believe it. From that time on, things got easier for me. Sometimes, when I met David Graybeard out in the forest, he would come up to see if I had a banana hidden in my pockets. The other chimps stared with amazement. Obviously, I wasn't as dangerous as I had thought. Gradually, they allowed me closer and closer. It was David Graybeard who provided me with my most exciting observation. One morning, near the peak, I came upon him squatting on a termite mound. As I watched, he picked up a blade of grass, poked it into a tunnel in the mound, and then withdrew it. The grass was covered with termites, all clinging on with their jaws. He picked them off with his lips and scrunched them up. Then he fished for more. With his piece of grass got bent, he dropped it, picked up a little twig, stripped the leaves off it, and used that. I was really thrilled. David had used objects as tools. He had also changed a twig into something more suitable for fishing termites. He had actually made a tool. Before this observation, scientists had thought only humans could make tools. Later, I would learn that chimpanzees use more objects as tools than any creature except for us. This finding excited Louis Leakey more than any other. In October, the dry season ended and it began to rain. Soon, the Golden Mountain slopes were covered with lush green grass. Flowers appeared, and the air smelled lovely. Most days it rained just a little. Sometimes there was a downpour. I loved being out in the forest in the rain, and I loved the cool evenings when I could lace the tent shut and make it cozy inside with a storm lantern. The only trouble was that everything got damp and grew mold. Scorpions and giant poisonous centipedes sometimes appeared in the tent, even a few times a snake. But if I was lucky, I never got stung or bitten. The chimpanzees often seemed miserable in the rain. They looked cold and they shivered. Since they were clever enough to use tools, I was surprised that they had not learned to make shelters. Many of them got coughs and colds, often during heavy rain, and seemed irritable and bad tempered. Once, as I walked through the thick forest in the downpour, I suddenly saw a chimp hunched in front of me. Quickly, I stopped. Then I heard a sound from above. I looked up, and there was a big chimp there, too. When he saw me, he gave a loud, clear, wailing "wow!" a spine-chilling call that was used to threaten dangerous animals. To my right, I saw a large black hand shaking a branch and bright eyes glaring threateningly through the foliage. And then came another "roar" from behind. Up above, a big male began to sway the vegetation. I was surrounded. I crouched down, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Suddenly, a chimp charged straight towards me. His hair bristled with rage. At the last minute, he swerved and ran off. I stayed still. Two more chimps charged nearby. Suddenly, I realized I was alone again. All the chimps had gone. Only then did I realize how frightened I had been. When I stood up, my legs were trembling. Male chimps, although they were only 4 feet tall when upright, were at least 3 times stronger than a grown man, and I weighed only about 90 pounds. I had become very thin with so much climbing in the mountains and only one meal a day. That incident took place soon after the chimps had lost their initial terror of me, but before they had learned to accept me calmly as part of the forest world. If David Graybeard had been among them, they probably would not have behaved like that, I thought. After my long days in the forest, I looked forward to supper. Dominic always had it ready for me when I got back in the evenings. Once a month, he went to Kigoma with Hassan. They came back with a few supplies, including fresh vegetables and fruit and eggs, and they brought my mail. That was something I really looked forward to. After supper, I would get out a little notebook in which I had scribbled everything I'd seen while watching the chimps during the day. I would settle down to write it all legibly in my journal. It was very important to do that every evening, while it was all fresh in my mind. Even on days when I climbed back to sleep near the chimps, I always wrote my journal first. Gradually, the weeks went by. I began to recognize more and more chimpanzees as individuals. Some, like Goliath, William, and Old Flo, I got to know very well because David Graybeard sometimes brought them with him when he visited camp. I always had a supply of bananas ready in case the chimps arrived.